President Ramaphosa has promised a review panel to look at the role of intelligence agencies and what they play during the Zuma administration, because the extent to which they were politicized for narrow factional aims, of course, became a major complaint of many political parties as well as civil society. Well, tonight I have the pleasure of speaking to a former spy boss who served both Presidents Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma. Vusi Mavimbela, who is about to publish his account of those years this Thursday. He's now South Africa's ambassador to Egypt. Welcome to The Fix, Mr. Mavimbela. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Karen.
Now, it is not very common for former spy bosses to write memoirs. One cabinet minister I spoke to said, my instructions are very strict. My memoir will be published when I'm dead because it will be safer for me to do so. I recently interviewed a colleague of yours, a former colleague, Mr. Barry Gilder, and he, of course, has written a work of fiction, The List. Part of that was, of course, also that you are bound by the Secrets Act. How did you get this incredible, gripping memoir that I spent the last 48 hours reading past the Secrecy Act?
By the way, Barry also published a memo.
Yes.
Before his latest book.
Yes.
Yeah, so publishing memos is not out of bounds of the former spies.
Yeah.
It's just that when you write, you must know where to stop.
Yes.
Or even if you want to tell about those really serious matters,
yes,
you tell them without revealing sources, revealing the methods, and so on and so forth. So there is a way of telling the real story.
After all, you were a spy boss, you know the loops. So this is an incredible account of your life. Of course, it starts, you know, way back where you grew up in KwaZulu-Natal. And of course, it ends with the way in which you continue to serve the government and the journey that you've traversed. What is particularly interesting for me, and I'll return to your upbringing, but to the political aspects, of course, is that you were the security, political and intelligence advisor of President Thabo Mbeki at one stage. And you had so many jobs, you became so exhausted, you had to, in fact, take off for a week. You became ill. But you played a very important part in, of course, bouncing off ideas with him, putting kitchen cabinets together, and so on. Now, the presidency of Thabo Mbeki were bedeviled by two things prior to the Zuma matter. The one was, of course, the question around his aid denialism, and the other, of course, the issue of Zimbabwe. I was fascinated, Mr. Mavimbela, about how you guys tried behind the scenes to try and get former President Mbeki out of the scientific maelstrom of arguments around whether there's a causal link between HIV and AIDS. But of course, he was right in there. He was an intellectual, and he had that famous fallout with Professor Makgoba, to whom he, of course, wrote the foreword for his book after he was treated so badly at Wits. I mean, it's the height of irony, isn't it?
No, those were dramatic times.
I mean, just tell our viewers what it took behind the scenes to try and get President Mbeki to back off from a backrooms rumors point of view, from a debate that was getting him absolutely nowhere, that was damaging brand South Africa, and that was alienating many, many South Africans who were, in fact, living with the consequences of the disease.
It had to be a multifaceted approach, but mainly really using the ANC, because our position was that it should be the ANC that drives whatever campaigns around AIDS.
Yeah.
And of course, the Minister of Health at the time should be at the center. And we were aware that the debate was damaging our principal, yes, that was President Mbeki. And we're trying to find a way of winning him off, yes, of the debate so that he takes the backside. So yeah, we went out, we talked to people in the ANC, we talked to people we knew that had also some strange views on AIDS, but who were close to him, yeah, to say, can you really play a part? Because everybody agreed. Even those who agreed with his position, yes, agreed that his involvement in the debate was damaging to him, was damaging to brand South Africa, was damaging even to the ANC.
Now, of course, the extent to which people went to try and deal with this matter was quite extensive. You recount, for example, the fact that a letter was written to Professor Makgoba, and it was then said he was the head of the Medical Research Council, and the letter was marked confidential, and it was done under the name of Nwako Ramatlhodi, the Limpopo Premier at the time, who had a very close political and theoretical and intellectual relationship with the president. And Mr. Makgoba, you say, later revealed that Ramatlhodi told him he had not written the letter, but that the letter had come from Mbeki's office. And in this letter, Mr. Ramatlhodi supposedly says, "My impression is that you have emerged as a towering authority on the issue. At least that is how the liberal press in the country and elsewhere in the world would have believed us. I find it deeply perplexing that you, of all people, should have found it necessary to engage the president in hostile polemic. I notice also for your efforts, you earned the fervent applause of precisely the same people who were against your election at Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Witwatersrand. As you report, Mokoko resorted to the most unprincipled ways and means." Now, that is quite an extreme intervention to try and get a premier to pretend to be to get the president to pretend to be a premier and engage a leading scientist, one of the best that we have in the world, that hails from our shores, on a polemic that the president had no business being in.
At the time, we actually also didn't know that actually it was Ramatlhodi, it was not Ramatlhodi that who had written. And we had thought that because at the time they were, as you say, they were really close, intellectually and otherwise. So it made logic that he had taken a position to defend the president. Only later on it got revealed that no, actually that was not the case. So it was quite revealing.
You know, Mr. Mavimbela, there's a lot we can speak about Thabo Mbeki and his years. I wrote a lot about it when I was at Business Day, of course, and I didn't agree with him, particularly on his Zimbabwe policy. And the way in which the tonality of him expressing our position on Zimbabwe, for example, was also what got us into hot water, not just outside of the country, but even with our allies, with democratic formations such as the trade unions, the South African Communist Party. Why do you think Thabo Mbeki was so convinced that it was important to tell the West that the Zimbabweans must sort out everything for themselves? And you point out so ironically in your book that it's Thabo Mbeki who went all around the world to get solidarity for South Africa in its struggle against apartheid.
Well, in the book, I go on to talk about other analysts who were saying, actually, perhaps Mbeki saw something that was likely to happen in South Africa in the future. Remember, at the time, he had a problem with the trade unions. And in Zimbabwe,
unmandated reflections.
Yes. And in Zimbabwe, the opposition had grown out of the trade unions. And even before then, in Zambia, the person who took over from Kaunda had also grown out of the trade
Mr. Chiluba, yes.
So there was a
pattern.
This kind of a domino effect in Southern Africa, which will start in Zambia, go to Zimbabwe, and perhaps it might end in South Africa.
So Mr. Mavimbela, are you saying that essentially that the subtext of Thabo Mbeki's hostility toward Morgan Tsvangirai and the MDC at that stage was born out of a conviction that the West wanted to influence Africa? But it jars because he had already begun to cut his links with the South African Communist Party. He'd already begun to cut his links with their strategic way of thinking. His rivalry with Slovo was well known. How do you juxtapose fearing that the West wants to determine the position of Africa when you've already ideologically abandoned a socialist future and aligned yourself with the market economy?
Mbeki was an anti-imperialist at heart no matter how you define that, because you know that his policies were not really communist or socialist at the end of the day.
The so-called third way was his way.
Yes, he was going with the market, but he still maintained the position that the West can't tell Africans what to do, can't tell Africa what to do. As Africans, we must do it our own way, which was a laudable position. I mean, we all supported that, we understood where he was coming from. So there was that stance to say, but we're Africans. And as Africans, we cannot be told by other people, especially our former colonizers, about how we should handle our issues and our matters and how we should solve our problem. They shouldn't determine the agenda of how we deliver ourselves from the state in which we are.
Now, the conclusion of those two big policy questions, of course, also led to the alienation between the president and the left in the alliance. I remember you saying in the book that someone like Issa Pahad often reflected on the fact that people like Mr. Vavi, people like Dr. Bladen Zimande wanted to be heard, wanted to be consulted, and so on. And of course, Thabo Mbeki had very little time or respect for any of them.
Well, Thabo Mbeki, and it comes out there in the book, he's a man, once he decides we are on the other side of him, he finds it very hard to pretend. He finds you can read him like a book. If he doesn't like you,
everything is on his face.
Yeah, if he doesn't like you, you'll see it.
Yeah.
He can't pretend. Even the way he greets you, the way he shakes your hand, it's that kind of, he can't pretend. I mean, that thing can be a strong point, but also it can be a weak point. So when those developments around COSATU and so on in the Communist Party, he had decided these are not the people I can work with. And so he took his stand. And once he takes his stand, Mbeki takes his stand, it's very difficult to move him.
He was in splendid isolation, as you said, as
Yes.
Fahad had said.
Yeah.
Well, we continue our conversation after the break. See you in a moment.